Hi, everyone.
Hi, Shabbat Journey. This is Hector. Rabbi, can you hear me? Rabbi Journey, can you hear me?
It's good to see you. I think we are uh, officially live on all our streaming services, and I believe that there is somebody is that maybe Hector or somebody else who's live officially services. Then I don't know why we're hearing. I believe that. Okay, I think that there should be no echo now. I'm not sure but hopefully there is no echo now, and hopefully whoever is co-hosting and teching can work on making sure that everybody is admitted to the room and muted and unmuted. But welcome everybody. It's good to have you here, and and we and we are going to begin Mincha in just a moment. I'll call page numbers from each of our Sidorim. It's good to have Marisol and Diane together again. It's nice when I see your names together there. That's so lovely. Shabbat Shalom to the both of you. So we'll begin on page 214 in Sidor Lev Shalem. We'll begin on page 226 in Sim Shalom for Shabbat and Festivals, the newer one, page 558 if you're in the older Sim Shalom Sidor. Ashri Yushavi Veitecha, Ojalilucha Seva, Ashrayam Shukachalo, Ashrayam Shadonai Elohav, Tila David. Tehillat Adonai Yidaber Pi, V'yorech Kol Basar Shem Kodsho Leolam Va'ed, V'anachnu Nevarech Ya, Mi'ata V'ad Olam, Hallelujah. We're on page 216, or whatever the following page is in your Sidor. Uva Litzion Gohel, Hushavi Fesha Be'Yakov Neum Adonai, V'ani Sobriti. V'etakadosh Shevti Lot Yisrael, V'karazel Zev V'yamar, Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzevot, Meloch Ol Haaretz Kevoto. V'tisayini ruach, V'shmacharai Kol Rash Gadol, Baruch Kevod Adonai Mimekomo. Adonai lo Leolam Va'ed, Adonai ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני. אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה ויאדיר. So at this point, we turn to the Torah service portion of our Shabbat afternoon services. And what that means for us, as we know, on Zoom and on YouTube, means that we're going to join together in some learning of Torah by chanting the first Aliyah from a Chumash. I'll chant for us from the beginning of Parshat Shofatim, which is the parsha that begins with the appointment of magistrates and officials and the judicial system, the description of the judicial system as it's outlined here towards the beginning of the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. If you're following along in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, you can turn to page 1088. If you're following along in any other Hebrew Bible, what you can do is open up to Deuteronomy, to chapter 18, verse 18. And that's where we begin with the first Aliyah next Shabbat morning, it's what we read today and Monday and Thursday in anticipation of this coming Shabbat. We're already thinking to next Shabbat. And we begin with a blessing, thanking God for the opportunity to chant and study Torah with all of you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Now I'll chant from this first aliyah. שופטים ושוטרים, תיתן לך בכל שעריך, אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך לשפטך, ושפטו את העם משפט צדק, לא תטה משפט, לא תכיר פנים, ולא תיקח שוחד, כי השוחד יעבר עיני חכמים, ויסלף דברי צדיקים. צדק צדק תרדוף, למען תחיה, וירשת את הארץ, אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך. לא תיטע לך אשרה כל עץ אצל מזבח אדוני אלוהיך אשר תעשה לך, ולא תקים לך מצבה אשר שונא אדוני אלוהיך לא תזבח. לאדוני אלוהיך שור ועשה, אשר יחיה בו מום כל דבר רע, כי תועבת אדוני אלוהיך הוא. כי ימצא בקרבך באחד שעריך, אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך, איש או אישה, אשר יעשה את הרע בעיני אדוני אלוהיך, לעבור בריתו, וילך ויעבוד אלוהים אחרים, וישתחו להם ולשמש או לירח, או לכל צבא השמיים אשר לא ציוויתי. והוגד לך ושמעת ודרשת היטב, והנה אמת נכון הדבר, נסתה התועבה הזאת בישראל, והוצאת את האיש ההוא, את האישה ההיא אשר עשו את הדבר הרע הזה אל שעריך, את האיש או את האישה וסקלתם באבנים ומתו, על פי שניים מתים, או שלושה עדים יומת המת, לא יומת על פי עד אחד. יד העדים תהיה בו, וראשונה להמיתו, ויד כל העם באחרונה, וביארת רע מקרבך, כי יפלא ממך דבר למשפט, בין דם לדם, בין דין לדין, ובין נגע לנגע, דברי ריבות בשעריך, וקמת ועלית אל המקום אשר יבחר אדוני אלוהיך בו, ובאת אל הכהנים הלוויים ואל השופט אשר יהיה בימים ההם, ודרשת ויגידו לך את דבר המשפט, ועשית על פי הדבר אשר יגידו לך מן המקום ההוא אשר יבחר אדוני, ושמרת לעשות ככל אשר יורוך, על פי התורה אשר יורוך, ועל המשפט אשר יאמרו לך תעשה לא תסור, מן הדבר אשר יגידו לך ימין ושמאל, והאיש אשר יעשה v'zadon levilti shemo ha'el hagohen ha'omed l'sharet sham et Adonai Elohecha el hashofet u'meit ha'ishahu u'vi'artaram Yisrael v'chol ha'am yishmeu v'yirahu v'lo yizidu nod. So that's the full first aliyah. Right towards the beginning, those famous words, tzedek, tirdof, justice. Yes, justice you should pursue, as Everett Fox, one of my favorite biblical translators, would have it. Or another wonderful, creative, and colorful way to translate that phrase, tzedek, tirdof, justly you should pursue justice, making it adverbial. And what a beautiful way to begin thinking about the way in which we hope that our judicial and magistrate system would be set up as a people, even as we're still receiving these devarim, these words, this second telling of our journey, as we're standing on this side of the Jordan with Moshe and thinking about what kind of a society we want to build. And then hearing these words today, so many generations later, and that resounding sense and sensibility of what it is that we look for when we build a system that is reliant on human action and human judgment. We have divine judgment, of course, existing in our system, and we think about tzedek and mishpat per God, but we also need to think about tzedek and the pursuit of tzedek through the human eye and the human ear. So that's what we're concerned with. A little preview before I move to asking if anybody is here and commemorating a particular individual and would like an El Male recited. I'll give you a preview that we'll study after we go through the rest of the Mincha service today. We're going to turn to chapter 17, verse 18. Shortly, and we're going to, that'll be on page 1093 if you're in Eitz Chaim, and we'll turn to these verses that are about what a king sitting on their throne ought to do when it comes to receiving the Torah, how they keep the Torah, what it means for them to write a Torah in their days. So we'll go there in just a few minutes. Before we do, I want to ask if anybody who is joining us wants to indicate that they're here to be sure that an El Male is recited in honor of a particular loved one this week. Is there anybody here who's indicating remembering a loved one this week? If not, and I don't see anybody who's indicating that, then we're going to move to the whispered private Amidah. You can find that in your Sidurim on page 223, 234, or 574. We recite it privately and standing in a whisper. If you haven't yet completed your own private Amidah, I invite you to continue at your own pace. We go straight to Aleinu, which is recited standing on page 231 or 248 or page 598 in the older Sim Shalom. Aleinu l'shabech ladon hakol, l'tekidu l'athu ser pereshi, shalom hazeh. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Warner's Kaddish can be found on page 232, 249, or 600. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael Ba'agala ubizman kari ve'imru amen. Yehi shemei rabba mevarach le'alam ulamei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei tekudsha berichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush b'chata v'nechamata. Damiram be'alma ve'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. I invite you to be seated if you are standing. We're going to turn now to some Torah study for a little bit. Hoping this can be a little bit interactive because we're going to go into some in-depth Torah study on a very particular part of the Parsha, just a set of a small number of verses. And after we get an opportunity to speak about these verses together, then my plan is to share with you two different takes on this set of verses. And after I share with you those two different takes on these sets of verses, I want it to lead into a preview of a course that I'm beginning to teach this coming Tuesday night, all throughout the month of Elul, which begins this evening, as we're beginning a bunch of learning series in the institution. And the course that I'm teaching is on ritual innovation. And all that we'll learn tonight will lead up to a little miniature introduction, a little bite about it, with the hopes that you'll join for the entirety of the course. So what I'd like to do is just take a look at the Torah reading together. And you can open up to whatever Hebrew Bible you have handy, or just listen, because I'm going to go through this really, really carefully with a fine-tooth comb. And we'll take apart these verses starting in chapter 17, verse 18, and try to figure out what the purpose is of the instruction that's given in these verses and what is actually meant in this place. V'haya. First of all, I want to point out that if you're familiar with modern Hebrew, one of the constructs you want to be familiar with here in the biblical Hebrew is the concept of vavayipuch, which there is no really past or future tenses in biblical Hebrew, but without getting into a whole grammatical lesson, this does flip the haya on its head. So it's really, and so it shall be, right? Not haya as in a modern Hebrew sense, but and so it shall be. Keshivto. Earlier today on Ziring Family Field, Rabbi Schatz was speaking about the meaning of ke before words and the Shnei Luchot HaBrit's take. It's a beautiful piece of Torah. I hope you listen to it in the recording if you didn't catch it live on the field or on Zoom, but you can hear it on our podcast or go back on the YouTube. And she spoke about this idea that ke as a pronoun, as a prefix before a word, has so many different meanings. And in the case of ke matanat yado. At the end of Parshat Re'eh, if you flip back a few pages, pre the Haftorah that sometimes comes at Re'eh, not today, you can see that ke matanat yado means like a gift of one's hand. You have to listen to her Torah to hear what the Shnei Luchot Abrid as a Musar teaching has to offer on this idea of what ke can mean there. Here, ke means in the time of, okay? Like ki, when, ke. V'haya kishivto al kise, on the throne, on the seat, mam lachto, on his on the seat of their sovereignty, okay? So on the seat of his throne, that's and he shall, right? We should, in brackets, imagine, and he shall, what should happen? Chatav lo, it should be that it should be written for him et, direct object, mishnei ha-Torah, a second or repetition version of ha-Torah hazot. That is the Torah, that is this one. Al sefer, on a sefer. We're going to get into what a sefer is in a moment. Mi lifnei hakohanim haleviim. That is before, or maybe by the hands of, the kohanim haleviim, which is a certain priestly class. V'hayita imo, and let it be with him. What's the v'hayita imo, and what's the it? I see Marlise mouthing the Torah thing, right? Like something like that. The sefer, right? The scroll, this thing. Okay, I guess I gave it away. The Torah thing that was written. Let it be with him. Vikara vo kol yemei chayav, and he should recite from it. Right? Remember, Koreh in modern Hebrew is like, reading from a book. Same way, sefer is a codex, that is a bound book like this one nowadays, but a sefer in the time of Deuteronomy means a scroll. Same way that kara here means recitation, as in kriyat Torah, okay? And he should recite from it, he should do recitation from it, kol yemei chayav, all the days of his life, lema'an, for the sake of, yilmad. What is Yomad? So he can learn, le yira et Adonai Elohav, to have some sort of an awe for Adonai, his Lord, lishmor et kol divrei HaTorah, to guard all of the words of HaTorah, hazot, ve et achukim ha'ele la'asotam. And these laws therein, or these laws that are these ones, la'asotam, for the sake of doing them. And then it goes on for one more whole phrase that a lot of ink is spilled on, but we're not going to get into as much today, going back to the tzedek tirdof business that I previewed. Levilti rum levavo me'echav. So he should be without rum levavo me'echav. He shouldn't have any kind of a hatred in his heart, or a haughtiness in his heart, liftedness in his heart, haughtiness like like self-righteousness, thinking that he's above others, above his brethren. Ul vilti sur min hamitzvah yaminu small. So you shouldn't stray from the command, that which is commanded, to the right or to the left of it. We hear this phrase a lot, to the right or to the left in Deuteronomy. Lema'an, for the sake of, to the end of, again, ya'arich yamim al mamlachto, hu uvana b'kerev Yisrael. So that he should lengthen the days of his sovereignty, not just for him, but for his children, like for the children of his reign, for the line of his reign, amidst the people of Israel. Okay, so we're not going to get into that last bit of it so much, even though that's actually the juiciest part of it, I think, which is why. But that is actually where I want to start. It is where I want to start, and it's not where we're going to spend most of our time, but it's where I want to start, because we get two lama'ans, we get two whys in those verses. Why is it that it would be a good idea for the sovereign, for the king, for the ruling power to have a copy of the Torah with them? And while you're at it answering, what do you think HaTorah Hazot, which is mentioned twice, What do you think that phrase means? You're welcome to answer both of those questions, or ask your own question if you want to pipe up.
Okay, I mean, you want to set the right, this is the law. You want them not to say, oh, I didn't quite read it right. You have the law and you assume that the copy is correct, and therefore you have no reason to deviate from the law. And if you can't remember it, you can read it.
Great. I really like it. You want him to keep it right by his side. They're imagining a male king, right? Keep it by his side at all times, because you want him to not be making things up. You want to have a reference.
Also, reminder who's the boss.
Great.
Not the king.
Right. That's right. Not the king. And also, by the way, who's the boss is the king who's holding on to the scroll of the boss, right? So it actually is empowering in its own right. But you're right. Who's the boss? Not the king, the one who is the commanding one. Great. Gary, that was very helpful. Anyone have any thoughts on HaTorah Hazot?
I do. And I actually think that the term isn't the same both times, because the first time we have Mishneh HaTorah Hazot, and the second time HaTorah Hazot. And I think you could take the word Mishneh out of Yud-Chet and the verse would read perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Right? So Mishneh HaTorah Hazot is why do you need to say like either a copy of, an additional version of, and what does that add to the conversation?
Fantastic. Joanna, you are thinking like Rashi, or if you ask me, the school of Rashi. Okay, that was a fantastic bridge. So Rashi is this French commentator, probably a whole school of commentary that we get compiled between the 11th and 13th centuries, right? And Rashi comes along and has the same thought. So Rashi's Dibur HaMatchil, his generative hook to get into this text is the same thing that Joanna is bringing up. He says, write a copy of this law. All right, I would get it if what you said was that the king should have the Torah with them at all times. That makes sense. But why should the king have to commission a copy of the Torah? What's the deal with make a copy of the Torah? Why should they have a copy of the Torah? Before I tell you what Rashi's answer to this was, I want to tell you that scholars, right, let's go to the conservative movements, Enlightenment, Hush, our Torah and Madai, this idea that like Torah and scholarship live side by side. There is a very high likelihood that what's being self-referenced here is the book of Devarim itself. Okay, so HaTorah Hazot may refer to just the book of Devarim. It's possible that Devarim is a self-referential Mishneh Torah within itself. It's a retelling, which is why it gets the name Deuteronomy, a second telling, because there is an understanding that it is probably a replication, a retelling in and of itself, may be scribed at a later date. So HaTorah Hazot may mean the whole Torah. It may mean just the previous section of laws that was given, if you want to be kind of rabbinic about it, right? HaTorah Hazot, the latest chunk of laws given. If you want to be scholarly about it, HaTorah Hazot might mean the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, now to Rashi. He says, why a copy? Why Mishneh Torah? V'chatav lo et Mishneh HaTorah Hazot. Why that? So he says, because the king, having the wealth to do so, should have 2 copies of the Torah. Before I tell you why do you think the king should have 2 copies of the Torah? What would they do with one and what would they do with another? If you had 2 copies of the Torah as king, what would you do with one and what would you do with the other?
Could I just ask a question first?
Sure.
I mean, just assuming there's an original copy of the Torah, where would it be in the temple? I mean, where are we?
This is a wonderful question because it depends on where we are in the history books when you're asking that question.
Mhm.
How many copies exist, and therefore how many how many versions exist of this around? Because we know that there are scribal errors that are recorded into the passed down Torah as well. It's a really wonderful question. We know, our understanding is that for a great deal of time, this Torah was oral. So at some point it's written down. At some point it's scribed by this time. And then the question is, how many copies exist and where? It depends on which point in history. So I don't have a great answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
I bet you Rabbi Rembam has a great answer for that question, though. Something tells me that he would have a really wonderful historical answer. Or I say I could come back to you with a great answer, but I can't answer on the spot. So anyone wants to take a stab at why a king would want to have 2 copies? Why would a king need 2 copies? I mean, like, I'll give you the first one, which is just, the Torah is so important. Let's have more than 1 copy out there, right? I'm going to commission a copy. Every person should commission a copy in their lifetime. Wouldn't that be nice? If you were a king, that'd be a nice reason. That's not why Rashi says. Does anyone else have any theories about that?
I don't have a theory yet, but to Marlisa's question also is, if every king is having a new Sefer Torah written for them, by the time we get to Kings 9, 10, 11, we've got lots of scrolls around. Where are all these scrolls? But looking at one king in isolation, one theory that I have is that the king keeps one in the palace with him, and the other one is in the temple where people are congregating to have services and laid, so that there's a scroll in the temple and there's a scroll in the palace.
Okay, that's darn close to what Rashi says. It's kind of inverted. So Rashi says he needs 2 Sifrei Torah because he has to keep one with him in his office space, right? In the place when he's Shivto al Kisei Mamlachto, okay? When he's sitting on his throne, he's got to have one. But also the king is going to travel, and he needs to have a copy of that Torah with him at all times. And so in order for that to be the case, in order for that Torah to stay behind in the office, right, so that people can reference it and he can have his appointed judges and magistrates still have that Torah with them, or perhaps that one just doesn't travel with him, he's got to commission a copy of the Torah so that he can have it with him at all times as well. There is several centuries later, in the 19th century in Hungary, the Ketav Sofer, whose commentary I love and I learned about from my teacher, Rabbi Daniel Goldfarb, who was Rosh Yeshiva when I was at the conservative yeshiva in 2007, and maybe when I was there in 2008 as well. He introduced us to the Ketav Sofer's commentary from Hungary. This is late 19th century. He says, that's not satisfying to me. It's not enough that he would need to have 2 copies of the Torah. Why can't he take the Torah? I don't know. I'm making up the why it's not satisfying to him, but it would also not be really all that satisfying to me that he needs to have 2 copies of the Torah just for the sake of keeping one back at home and one to take one out with him. So he turns it into a lesson about the way that the king would regard Torah for himself and for his people. So he says the leader in any community, but we're using the model of king here, should have a Torah hazot, one that they observe for themselves. And when the leader is observing the Torah from their self, they should observe it bizhirut uv daknut, and with absolute precision. So when they read the Torah for themselves, and when they interpret the laws for themselves, and when they hold themselves to the Torah, they should be strict. And they have this other Torah to take to the people. And when they take the Torah to the people, they should give latitude. They should teach them more according to the spirit of the law. Lifnim misharat hadin. They should give more leniency. They should assume best intentions. And in that way, one should have the way that they regard Torah when it comes to themselves, and the way that they regard Torah when it comes to other people. Before I move to how this applies to the ritual realm, does anyone have any responses or reactions to the Ketav Sofer's take on that idea?
As you were talking about that, I was looking back at the word Mishnah and thinking of like how we use it, like when we talk about like Mishnah and Talmud, right? Where Mishnah means a teaching, right? And I get the connection because especially in antiquity, you learn by repetition. So a second telling is how one learned. But if we look at it as like the teaching of this Torah, then like what it's saying is every king is commanded to teach Torah in their way, which in essence is like to interpret Torah for their times.
Correct. That's exactly it. You have to abide by Torah for yourself. And when you do that, you hold yourself to Torah. But then you also have to teach Torah. You're responsible for getting the Torah out to the people. And when you do that, that interpretation is on you. And you've got to teach that humanely and bring it to the people humanely. And we hold other people to a different standard than we hold ourselves to, says the Ketav Sofer. I'm really moved by this idea. I mean, what would the world be like if we each held ourselves to the highest standard possible and viewed others with as much leniency as possible? If we could live within that breach and everyone truly upheld it, that would be a really beautiful world where we assume the best intentions of others, but held ourselves to the highest accountability possible. I think that's a wonderful type of world to build. It's a wonderful micro community, by the way, to try to build. We could say that about governance and accountability within any organization we're a part of, right? We could say that within work that we do, if we might hold leadership positions or maybe not hold leadership positions in places of work or volunteership. I think it's a nice thing to strive for. I also think, to move to this idea of ritual and ritual innovation, these are some of the biggest seeds planted in the Torah towards the idea that from its inception, when Torah was handed to the people by other people, when we move to this piece of Torah, when we're talking about Shoftim u'Shotrim, the magistrates and the appointed officials, not just Moshe and not just Yehoshua, not just this lineage that's going forward, but imagining forward a whole system of people, the unnamed kings who are to be kings eventually in the future, that we are imagining that the Torah is in their hands. It's not just Lo B'Shamayim, he as a principle, that the Torah is not just in the heavens, but that we're imagining that there is this Torah, and then every person is going to go out there in the world and use that Torah in a different way, both for themselves and for others. So we're going to take this Torah and we're going to live it out, and live it out ritually in a way that must live and breathe and even be described far beyond the words that this Torah can possibly imagine. right? The world's going to evolve far beyond the world that this Torah can imagine. I think that's in great tension with that last bit in verse 20. And that's partly what makes it so difficult in this section of Torah for those who crave the observant life and who want to feel as though they are following the derech, the true path of Torah. This idea that uvilti sur min mitzvah yaminu small, that you wouldn't deviate from even the right or the left of mitzvah. And yet we've already said that the Torah is going to be copied and put into the hands of the kings. And then the king's going to put it in the hands of appointed judges. And we are going to be living this Torah out. And the project that evolves out of Torah becomes the early oral rabbinic conversation that evolves into the Mishnah, that evolves into the Talmud, that evolves into the codes. And all of that has the intention of becoming the lived ritual landscape of the Jewish people. Like, what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis? So the course that I'm teaching over Elul is a course on the idea of ritual and how it plays out in our modern life and how it emerged from Judaism and how Judaism compels us to always be in the space of innovation and always be in a space of personal intentionality around Torah and around lived Torah, wherever it is that we're out there and living out Torah. I want to give you a sneak preview of something that we're going to be doing together. I discovered the work of some really, really wonderful folks at the Stanford Design Lab. So there's a design lab up at Stanford University, and within that, a subset of people who work on the concept of ritual design. This isn't the only part of the reading list that I'll give. It's a long reading list, not required, but a reading recommendation list for this class. And there's a PhD named Kursat Ozank, and he co-wrote with Margaret Hagan a couple of books compiling all the work that they've been doing in their design lab. These folks are not talking about Jewish ritual in particular, but they're talking about the idea of ritual science. And they're particularly interested in the evolution of ritual science in the workplace, which is one microcosmic social environment in which individual and also group dynamics around ritual matter. And what they're really interested in is there a real impact from ritual? Does ritual matter? I asked in the beginning of this conversation, why, right? Why do this? But they start from the question, does it even have an impact? Does it even matter? In one of the other books that I'll introduce in this series, I'll talk about this idea that we have data showing that more lives are saved by firefighters who eat meals together with their fellow firefighters in their unit per data worldwide. They're interested, ritual data scientists, in this idea that ritual matters. And my personal thesis around this is that ritual is routine elevated. And my goal around Jewish life is to always be wrenching us out of routinization and back into ritualization. And the way to do that, from my perspective, is to give people a sense, all of you included, and anyone who participates in this class now or any other time that I have designed it for offering, is empower you to feel like you can innovate around ritual, because that's what refreshes ritual. Ozank and Hagan, in their books, they offer 4 principles of ritual. And I add a 5th, that's a Jewish principle of ritual. They say that rituals have a magical je ne sais quoi factor to them. Can't quite put your finger on what makes a ritual so magical. 2, this is going to sound very Jewish, Rituals are done intentionally with the person tuned into this being a special moment. 3, that a ritual carries with it a symbolic value that gives a sense of purpose and that it is beyond the practical. It cannot just be practical, it has to be practical plus, practical and. And principle 4, which I love and I spend lots of time on, is a ritual evolves over time to better suit the people and the situation. What I add to this as a 5th principle in the times that I teach this either to rabbinical students or to others who I do this work with is the idea of chazaka, of repetition of ritual, even rituals that we innovate for ourselves or for the groups that we're a part of, fix those rituals and create true deepened magic. So the more that we actually repeat those rituals, that doesn't send them back into the doldrums of routinization, it actually implants them as being authentic. And that's so Jewish and so interesting to me. So this idea, to go all the way back to the Torah, and we'll wrap on this note, is that just like ritual is all about the idea of taking the routine and elevating it up to the ritual, right? Taking something that is intended and even commanded to be a routine and elevating it to be a ritual. I imagine this command to the king who is sitting on a throne to go and commission a sefer to be written, to be a command to say, you cannot just receive the Torah. You must take that Torah and in some fashion create Mishneh Torah. You have to go out and teach it. You have to commission a copy of it, and you must go out there and teach it through your own lips in such a way that it becomes yours and becomes your people's by way of whatever way you teach it. And maybe in that way, it's given a je ne sais quoi, it's given intentionality. It becomes something ritually renewed and much more elevated than it would have been were it just handed down from person to person. So I'm really hopeful that some of you, all of you, will come along for this ride doing some of this ritual work in the coming weeks. I hope you learned something new about these very few small set of verses in our portion. And may any and all of us have the opportunity to commission a Torah scroll in our lifetime, because how cool would that be? And with that, we're going to move to Mariv. This is Mariv for Rosh Chodesh. I'm saying that out loud to remind myself so I don't forget to announce that we need to include Ya'aleh v'Yavo in the Amidah, but I'll make that announcement again when we get there. If you are in Sidor Lev Shalem, we begin on page 264. If you're in the newer Sim Shalom, we're on 281. If you're in the older Sim Shalom, we're on page 200. You can remain seated for the beginning of Mariv as we skip the Baruch Hu and other Devarim, Shebik Dusha, things that require a minyan in person, except for the mourner's Kaddish. Vehu rachum yichaber bo mela yashchiv yirba l'shiva po v'lo yehir kol chamato Adonai Hoshea melech yaneinu v'yom koreinu Baruch atah Adonai. Umavir yom umivi ladu mavdil ben yom uvin lai ladonai tzvot shem hol chai v'kayem tamidim lo chalinu le'olam va'ed Baruch atah Adonai hamariv aravim avato. V'ahavat tasir mimenu le'olamim Baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael El melech ne'eman Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Ani Adonai Elohechem emet. Umalchut ha'beretzon kibelu alehem. Moshe v'Yisrael lechanu shira v'simcha rabba v'imru chulam. Mi chamocha b'elim Adonai mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh. Norati lo tasefele. Malchutecha rahu v'anecha b'olgeyam livnei Moshe. Zei li'anu v'yameru. Adonai himlach le'olam va'ed. ונאמר כבד אדוני את יעקב, וגילו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גל ישראל. השכיבנו אדוני. ושמור צאתנו ואוהינו לחיים, ושלום יצבי עד עולם ברוך אתה אדוני, שמר עמו ישראל לעד. כי המלכות שלך היא, ולא ליעדים לך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ואל כל מעשיו. The Amidah for the end of Shabbat is found on page 270, 286, or 210 in the older Sim Shalom. As I mentioned earlier, not only do we include in the first blessing in the interior of the Amidah the words for the end of Shabbat, but also Ya'aleh v'Yavo towards the end of the Amidah in acknowledgement of the new month of Elul, which officially begins this evening. If you're still praying your own private Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We are on page 279 or 292 or 682, Vihinoam. Vihinoam, Adonai Eloheinu, Aleinu Masiyadenu Konena, Leinu Masiyadenu Konenehu. Hikrini bene huimono chivitzarat achalitzehu achbatehu orech yamim masbiyehu virehu vishuhati orech yamim masbiyehu virehu vishuhati. If you're in any siddur other than Lev Shalom, we continue on the following paragraph or page. If you're in Lev Shalom, we're on page 216, second paragraph. Ve'ata kadosh shevtei lot Yisrael, v'karazel ze ve'amar, kadosh 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 Adonai tzvot melech la'aretz kevodo. V'tizleini ruach v'shma acharei kol rash gadol, baruch kevod Adonai mimekomo. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. V'yivtechu v'chayu shemecha ki lo azavta toreshecha Adonai. Adonai chafetz l'man tzidko, yagdil Torah v'yadir. We'll go to Aleinu, page 281, 297, or 696. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol atei gedulat yotzer bereshit shelo asanu kagei haratzot v'lo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama shelo sam chelkeinu kahem v'gohar aleinu k'chol hamunam v'anachnu koreim u'mishachavim u'modim lifnei melech malchi hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. Hakatu v'tortach Adonai himloch le'olam v'hevene mar v'heyah Adonai l'melech kol haaretz b'ma hu'yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad. Mourner's Kaddish, page 282. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabbah v'yama divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayichon v'yomechon uv'chayei techol beit Yisrael Ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shemei rabbah mevarach le'olam u'lamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha berichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechamata damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'ramav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. I wish you a Shavua Tov and a Chodesh Tov, and we'll do Havdalah. A reminder as I'm lighting my Havdalah candle that there's an ongoing Shiva Minyan at the Redner residence tomorrow morning's 8 a.m. Zoom Minyan for the Daily Minyan, which is its normal link, will take place from the Redner residence. So if you'd like to join a Minyan in person, they're having an outdoor backyard Minyan. It's at in the 1100 block of High Point Street, and you can check your Shabbat bulletin for details. You're welcome to comfort them if you're comfortable in person or join on Zoom. And then we'll continue with regularly scheduled programming. Blowing of shofar for Elul starts on Monday morning because technically speaking, the first day of Rosh Chodesh, Elul is still Av, 2-day Rosh Chodesh. So that'll begin on Monday morning.
Oh, you had one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yours?
You have all?
Nope, I'm good. All right, here we go. Privilege of having a handy ukulele here. Here we go. Ya nai na nai 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 ya nai na nai nai ya nai ya nai na nai 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 ya nai na nai nai ya nai 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 ya na nai ya nai 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 ya na nai 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 oh I na nai ya nai 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 ya na nai ya nai nai Hini el Yeshuati etach velo echai Ki ozi v'zimerat Adonai vayehi li Yeshua Ushaftem mayim besason Vimanei Yeshua L'Adonai ha-Yeshua Alam chavir chatechasela Adonai tzevaot Imanu Miskav lainu Elohei Yaakov Sela Adonai tzevaot Asher yadam botei hachbach Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Yaneinu V'yom Koreinu LaYehudim Haytahora V'simcha v'sason V'gar Kein Tihei Lanu Kos Yeshuot Esa Uv'shem Adonai Ekra Yainenai Yainenai Nai Yainenai Yainenai Nai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam bohori peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam bohori minei besamim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam bohori miorei ha'esh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechol shemay Yisrael amim. V'ino hashvi'i l'sheish yemei hamaseh. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil ben kodesh lechol.
Amen.
Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishvi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, V'imhera v'yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David. Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov, everybody. A happy Elul to everyone. I hope it's a healthy month ahead for all of us. Stay safe, stay healthy, continue to join us however you feel comfortable. Again, services 8 a.m. tomorrow on Zoom or at the Redner Residence for Shiva tomorrow evening, again, as usual, at 7 p.m. at our daily Minyan evening link. And we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.